So it's been a very interesting conference for me. I've seen a lot of people whom I've not met before and heard a lot of perspectives that I've not heard before. So thank you for those. I'm going to be talking about something which many of you might not want to know about, which is, are there actually negative effects of nicotine? And let me just reassure people that nicotine is a minor contributor to the harms of cigarette smoking. So I have no argument with nicotine for harm reduction, but I think there are some important things we should know about it and look at the evidence, and I'll talk more about why that is an issue in a second. My disclosures, I want to make these clear because I know some people have strong views about this. I have consulted with pharmaceutical companies that market smoking cessation medications. I do believe in smoking cessation medications. And I've also been a paid expert witness in litigation against tobacco companies regarding nicotine addiction. So the questions, the main question for me is that the harms and risks of nicotine are an essential consideration in assessing the public health impact of nicotine-based harm reduction. As I said, I think nicotine is much safer than cigarette smoking, but there are questions that come up. So if you are a lifelong vapor, should you feel secure about vaping lifelong? Should you think about quitting vaping? If I'm a physician and I have a patient who is a vapor and quit smoking, which I would congratulate them, should I encourage them to stop because of health effects? So there are some questions about health effects of nicotine that are relevant, even in the context of supporting harm reduction. So what I'm going to talk about is what we currently know about the safety of long-term use of nicotine delivered without tobacco combustion. And I would say that my perspective about this is changing all the time because papers are written all the time. So my talk now is different than the talk I gave 2 months ago in some respect. The first point I need to make is that nicotine has got structural similarities to acetylcholine, which is the main neurotransmitter in the brain and the body. So the nicotine acts on nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which are present in the brain, or neurons, and non-neuronal tissues. So nicotine affects virtually every organ in the body. One of the problems about this is when we look at studies in cells, nicotine affects almost every cell, almost every organ. There are many animal studies. And these sometimes are done in isolation outside of the sort of total body homeostasis. So we need to consider the limitations of animal studies. From my point of view, they provide biological plausibility, but where possible, we need to get confirmation of any harmful effects in humans. So I will try to do that where I can. Some of my comments will be technical. I'll try to explain them in a way that are understandable. This is a summary of just the main pharmacologic effects of nicotine that have been concerned. There are others which I'll talk about later. So the main one is that it facilitates neurotransmitter release, especially dopamine, which underlies addiction. And that's the pleasurable parts of smoking and the parts that people like about smoking. There's also sympathetic neural stimulation. So the fight or flight, it activates your sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline is released, and so it's got a stimulant effect, which also some people like. It could also have some adverse cardiovascular implications. Nicotine does some other things. It suppresses the immune system. So in several animal models of immune-related diseases, it actually improves outcomes, but could also be a risk for, say, infection. It's a cause of oxidant stress, which can cause cell damage. It can cause dysfunction of endothelial cells. Those are the blood cells that line blood vessels, so that blood vessels might not dilate as well. It inhibits apoptosis. So apoptosis is a term for cell death that is sort of programmed and is often beneficial. So if a cancer cell is present, you want to kill that cell. And nicotine has got effects that may block the killing of cells that should be killed, which is a bit of a concern about cancer. And some nicotine effects promote cell growth, including angiogenesis, which is generation of new blood vessels. Again, these are effects that have mostly been seen either in organ systems or in animals, and it's hard to say how much of this occurs in humans. So this is my current perspective, and this changed from my last talk, about the major safety concerns of nicotine and the probability that these are real. And the probability is based combination of biological plausibility from animal studies and human experimental studies, plus human data. So addiction, I think, is definite. Cardiovascular disease and reproductive toxicity is probable, and so I would disagree with Linda Bold, and I'll explain why. I sort of disagree, but not fully disagree. Infectious disease and cancer, I say possible. And COPD, there's some biological plausibility, which I'll show you, but I have seen no evidence at all in humans, and so I say that is unlikely, but could change tomorrow. So I'd like to go through each of these and make some comments. So nicotine and addiction. I think you all recognize that nicotine is essential for tobacco addiction, but also other factors enhance addictiveness. For example, we know that flavors and tastes are an important part of reinforcement from smoking. We know that inhibition of monoamine oxidase, which is an enzyme in the brain that breaks down dopamine. If you inhibit monoamine oxidase and you give someone nicotine, dopamine lasts longer, and so you have more reinforcing effects. So that can enhance the addictiveness of nicotine, shown in animal studies. The speed of nicotine delivery to the brain is a key determinant of addiction. So smoking cigarettes is more addictive than snus in general, although Lars showed some data suggesting that self-report is similar. Also, the adolescent brain, at least in animal studies, the adolescent brain seems to be more vulnerable, and nicotine in at least rodents interferes with the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in judgment and executive functioning. And so there were concerns about youth using nicotine affecting behavior and later drug use behaviors. Here's something which I call nicotine addiction cycle. This is similar to addiction cycle for opiates or whatever. So it says a person smokes a cigarette, you get rapid absorption of nicotine in the bloodstream in the brain, so you get an effect within a few seconds of smoking a cigarette. That produces arousal, mood modulation, and pleasure, which is why people smoke cigarettes. Then even within a day, there's some tolerance to these effects and physical dependence, which means when you don't have the drug, you have withdrawal symptoms. So people have withdrawal symptoms, and then they get a craving, partly for positive effects, partly to manage withdrawal symptoms, and so they self-medicate and they smoke a cigarette. And for a given person, if they're not constrained, their intake of nicotine is about the same day to day to day to day. So a person gets into the cycle and smokes in a pretty consistent way. And if you change products, they will still try to get the same amount of nicotine. Some comment about daily exposure to nicotine, because I think is interesting. There are ways biochemically to assess exposure to nicotine. And what are some of the things we know? Well, we know that Swedish snus users and former smokers who use e-cigarette only, based on cotinine levels, which is a breakdown product of nicotine, and a measure of nicotine exposure, have about the same intake of nicotine as regular smokers. So snus users, e-cigarette users only, and smokers take in about the same amount of nicotine per day. In experimental switching studies, we've done, Lynn Dawkins' group has done it, show that when you switch a person from an e-cigarette with one nicotine delivery to another, there is a fair amount of titration. So people adjust their behavior to take in about the same amount of nicotine per day. So let's go on. One comment, this is a little bit of a diversion, but I want to make this point because I think this is important. This addresses the question that's come up about should e-liquid nicotine concentrations be regulated? And this has to do with titration questions. So I show you 3 products. The top one is an advanced generation high voltage battery device. The second is a tank device, and the third one is Juul. And the top 2 are cotinine level, nicotine concentrations and cotinine levels. I don't have cotinine levels in regular Juul users, but we know from the pharmacokinetics that nicotine delivery is good. But I want to make the point that if you use a device with a nicotine concentration of 4 milligrams per mil, a high voltage battery device, you get the same cotinine level as someone with a device that's 22 milligrams per mil. And probably the same with the Juul. What this means is to get the same amount of nicotine, which people will get, you have to take in 10 times the aerosol to get the same amount of nicotine with a 4 milligram device compared to a 50 milligram device. To me, there are concerns, which I won't talk about here, but concerns about the toxicity of aerosol constituents. And if that's the case, we actually would be much better using higher nicotine devices with less aerosol exposure. So the idea of regulating upper limits of, say, 20 milligrams per mil, to me, doesn't make any sense from the safety point of view. So let's just put that on the table. Some comments about nicotine pharmacokinetics, and again, I'll use e-cigarettes as a comparison. Here's studies from our laboratory, others have shown the same thing, that nicotine pharmacokinetics with e-cigarette use can be similar to those of a cigarette, but also quite variable. Some cases are quite low. But if you look at regular use patterns, these are data from one of our studies where we just let people use ad lib for 90 minutes. We record whenever they puff an e-cigarette, look at nicotine levels. And what most of our vapors do is they take intermittent puffs. Sometimes they cluster 4 or 5 at a time. But the curve here is much different than cigarette smoking, where you see 8 or 10 puffs every 40 minutes. You see big spikes and falling off. So the blood level curves are quite different. And so the nature of the reinforcement and the addictiveness could potentially be much different. This looks more like you would see with snus in a sense. So some comments about the addictiveness of e-cigarettes versus regular cigarettes. And I take these data from the US PATH study, which is a nationally representative study in the US, data just published, involving 32,000 adults in 2013, 2014. One of the measures that I use, one of the things I think about for the addictiveness of the product is what percentage of people who have tried it have become regular daily smokers. And you can see here, this has been true for years, that about 23 or 25% of people who try cigarettes become regular smokers. For e-cigarette use, 7% of people who use e-cigarettes become regular e-cigarette users, suggesting that the intrinsic addictiveness of this as becoming addicted and using it for nicotine is less. A second study from PATH that was shown here looked at 3,400 cigarette-only users and 156 e-cigarette users, and looked at some of the data that we look at for extended dependence. And we find that time to first use, not for cigarette, first use, for cigarettes was 20 minutes on average, for e-cigarettes was 30 minutes, suggesting less dependence. And if you ask people, are they considered themselves to be addicted, strong cravings, difficult to refrain, really need to use, the odds ratios were always much stronger for cigarettes than e-cigarettes. So these data suggest, even though nicotine intake per day is the same, that something is different about cigarettes and e-cigarettes makes cigarettes more addictive. Well, that's just that comparison. Now just a comment about youth and the gateway question. These are data from the US 12th graders looking at the extent of e-cigarette use by smoking status. And just focus on the red bars, which are e-cigarette users who were never smokers. First, you can see that 93.5% don't use e-cigarettes at all. But of those who use e-cigarettes, the vast majority use 5 days or fewer per month. That is not the pattern we see with cigarette smokers and kids. When someone starts smoking as a kid, they smoke much more than 5 days a month. So the escalation pattern among youth looks much different. So my comments about youth addiction risk is that, one, the pharmacokinetic profile is different, lower peak nicotine levels with usual patterns of use. I mentioned before, cigarette smoke, I think, is more addictive than nicotine per se. Youth epidemiology finds much experimentation, occasional use, and also the use of non-nicotine liquids. And from my point of view, the progression of e-cigarette use to cigarette use, which I think is well documented that occurs, but I do not think that's mediated by nicotine addiction. I think these are often polysubstance users. Once you smoke in the US at least, many e-cigarette users smoke marijuana. And once you smoke one thing, you're more likely to smoke something else. So I have no doubt there's some progression from e-cigarette use to regular smoking, but I do not think it's mediated by becoming addicted to nicotine from e-cigarettes. Okay, so some comments about the cardiovascular safety. So first, this is a list of the cardiovascular toxins in cigarette smoke. And there are many of them that are important. One comment I just want to make about my dear friend Mike Russell's comments that you smoke from nicotine and die from the tar. That made sense at the time, but actually we're probably dying more from the volatile organic compounds. So things like acrolein and whatnot, there are actually many things in the gaseous phase that are even more toxic than the tar phase. It's just a minor point. I think Mike was right in principle. So oxidizing chemicals, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, particles, heavy metals. Nicotine may play some role, but clearly it is a minor role compared to everything else. The main thing from my point of view in terms of nicotine concern has to do with sympathetic neural stimulation. Again, this is fight or flight. So this means that heart rate increases. We know that if you're a regular cigarette smoker, your heart rate is 7 beats per minute higher per day on a 24-hour average. Same thing's probably true with these cigarettes. Blood pressure goes up, cardiac contraction increases, there's constriction of blood vessels, including in some people coronary blood vessels. Arrhythmias, heart arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats, which in some cases can be fatal, those are augmented by adrenaline, which is increased by nicotine. Catecholamines can cause lipid abnormalities, which can increase cardiovascular risk, can play a role in insulin resistance and diabetes. We heard something the other day about snus and diabetes, very interesting, and there's biological plausibility that nicotine could contribute. And inflammation. While nicotine per se has got anti-inflammatory effects, if it activates the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system can have pro-inflammatory effects, which makes it very complicated in terms of the net effect. But these are the concerns. The figure there are from data from one of our studies looking at adrenaline excretion in the urine in a crossover study where we had dual users either smoke cigarettes or use e-cigarettes as desired or abstain from both. And you can see that adrenaline release is the same for e-cigarettes as regular cigarettes. That's a nicotine effect. Seems pretty clear. Here's a complicated diagram which I use to talk about the cardiovascular safety of e-cigarettes, but if you just focus on the nicotine side, to summarize what I said, nicotine activates the sympathetic nervous system, causes catecholamine release, increases the work of the heart, which increases the demand for blood and oxygen. It can constrict coronary blood vessels. It can also constrict other blood vessels, which reduce the blood flow to the heart. So there's more demand, less supply. And that can cause what's called myocardial ischemia, so not enough blood supply to the heart. And then if you're also releasing adrenaline in the context of ischemia, you have a greater risk of sudden death. I'll explain why that's important in a second. So we've heard a lot about snus, and the problem about understanding nicotine from smoking is that there's so many other things, there's no way to dissect nicotine from smoking in smokers. But snus gives us a nice opportunity to say, what does nicotine itself do? Given the limitations that it's not inhaled, but the levels of nicotine intake are similar for snus compared to smoking. So the snus, you've heard a lot about that. Here's a summary of at least my reading of snus. Again, similar daily nicotine exposure, but slower absorption. Studies have looked at platelet activation of blood cells, which is an important part of acute cardiovascular events, does not seem to occur in snus users. Carotid intimal thickness is a study that's done with an echo tests in the blood vessel in the neck, and the thickness of the carotid intima is sort of a marker of atherosclerosis, non-invasive marker. It has been well shown that cigarette smokers is a dose-response increase with smoking and carotid intimal thickness. With snus, there's not. So it does not look like snus accelerates atherosclerosis. Case control studies show no increase in the risk of myocardial infarction or stroke, but a small but significant increase in case fatality. Now, this may have some confounding, but it has biological plausibility as well, because if you have a heart attack and you also have more adrenaline because of snus use, that could potentially increase the risk of a fatal arrhythmia. So there is a plausibility there. One study, which there's only one study, but this is very bothersome to me at least, as a study which is shown in this slide, the Arafalk study, which looked at people after a heart attack and looked at the follow-up in the next, I think, 2 years, and looked at those who were snus users or smokers and those who quit snus or continued to use. And what you can see in both cases, the people who quit had reduced mortality, and people who continued to use had increased mortality. I know that there's some concern about confounding here, but to me this raises concerns that if you have cardiovascular disease, I'm not sure that I would advise someone to keep on using nicotine. Again, to get back to the questions I asked in the very beginning, are there some people who it's probably not a good idea to use nicotine? And I think if you have cardiovascular disease, you probably shouldn't. Assuming you're not a smoker. If you're a smoker, nicotine is better than smoking. So my summary for cardiovascular disease is there is biological plausibility, there's epidemiological evidence that nicotine may contribute to acute cardiovascular events. Short-term nicotine use poses little cardiovascular risk, many studies of NRT, and vaping as well. And long-term nicotine use may be harmful in the presence of cardiovascular disease. Reproductive toxicity. We heard a lot about this in the first session today. And it's a very interesting question. As I understand Linda Boll, I'm not sure she's here, but she was talking about nicotine use in smokers. And I agree with her, nicotine use in smokers is not harmful. The question I'm addressing in this talk is whether nicotine use is intrinsically harmful if you're not a smoker. And I think the evidence is likely that it is. Animal studies overwhelmingly show that exposure to nicotine in animals, rats mostly, show impaired neural development, brain development, and impaired and altered behavior after birth in rats. Monkey studies show nicotine exposure impairs lung development and causes some impairment in lung function later on in life. But what's most convincing to me are the data on snus. You've heard there are several studies suggesting that snus use without smoking is associated with a risk of preeclampsia, spontaneous abortion, preterm birth, and lower birth weight, which are not good. So I show you this figure from a study of England, and this gives the odds ratio compared to no users whatsoever. So for gestational age, smokers have about a 3-fold odds ratio. Snus users 1.25, slightly increased but not significant. If you look at preterm delivery, both cigarette smoking and snus have significantly increased ratios compared to not users. And the one which is most interesting to me as a cardiologist is preeclampsia, which is hypertension at the end of pregnancy, sometimes associated with seizures, adverse birth outcomes. Cigarette smoking, the one good thing about cigarette smoking is that it reduces the risk of preeclampsia. But snus increases the risk of preeclampsia. Now, why is that? Well, the current thinking is that carbon monoxide, while it does some bad things to the heart, is also a vasodilator, so it dilates blood vessels. Nicotine constricts blood vessels, because carbon monoxide may reverse the effect of nicotine vasoconstriction. But if you have snus use unopposed, you can have vasoconstriction, and that could lead to preeclampsia. So my bottom line is I'm fully supportive of the use of nicotine in pregnant smokers to get them to quit smoking. But I do not think it is a good idea for pregnant women who are not smokers to use nicotine products. Nicotine and cancer. It's going to be hard to see some of this text, but let me just summarize. There are nicotine receptors on many cells, including cancer cells. Nicotine can enhance cell growth, including cancer cell growth, and also angiogenesis, new blood vessels, which play a critical role in metastasis of cancer and spreading of cancer. Almost done. Stimulation of cell survival, we talked about that. Animal studies show enhanced tumor growth and metastasis. Human snus shows no evidence of cancer causation, except maybe pancreatic and esophageal, which if that's the case is probably nitrosamine. But 2 studies here. One on the left shows if you implant lung cancer cells in a mouse and you give them nicotine to drink, and you follow them for 16 days, the mass of tumor is substantially increased. The one on the right is interesting. This is a new study about prostate cancer in humans. Interestingly, prostate cancer is not a smoking-related cancer, but if you have prostate cancer and you're a smoker, your survival is less. This study suggests that the effects on prostate cancer mortality and all-cause mortality, once you have the diagnosis, is increased both by snus and by smoking. So if nicotine is promoting cancer, this would be consistent with that. So I got two more issues to talk about. I'll do very quickly. Nicotine and infectious disease risk. I won't go through the mechanism here. Let me just show you this one study that raises concerns to me. This is an e-cigarette study in mice. So it's treatment of mice for 2 weeks with an e-cigarette containing nicotine. There was no control in the study without nicotine. And then they inoculated the nose of these mice with influenza A virus and looked at survival. The top 2 lines are a lower dose of virus, the bottom 2 lines are a higher dose of virus. And the e-cigarette treatment resulted in increased mortality at both doses, suggesting that there's some effect of e-cigarettes with nicotine on immune defenses. And I don't have time to talk about which ones. My final slide for data, then I'll conclude. Nicotine and chronic lung disease. I never thought there would be any connection. There are many potential effects, as I've listed here, which I don't have time to talk about, that could implicate nicotine in the pathogenesis of chronic obstructive lung disease. But I want to show you data from one study that is very concerning. This was a study that looked at, again, e-cigarettes, looking at e-cigarettes with no nicotine and with 18 milligrams per mil nicotine. 4-month exposure to rats. They looked at a lot of the cell function, inflammatory responses, some of the inflammatory markers, other markers, and the nicotine-treated animals had markers consistent with those abnormalities seen in chronic lung disease. But most strikingly, this slide, if you look at the rightmost, the 18 milligram per mil nicotine, you'll see that the airways have much bigger spaces. So there's loss of lung tissue, and the bigger airway spaces are characteristic findings of emphysema. So in these mice that got e-cigarettes with nicotine, but not the same e-cigarette without nicotine, showed emphysema changes. And this is why I think it's very important to get data from Sweden, for example, to see, is there any evidence at all that this might be the case in humans? So to wrap up, I apologize for going long. Nicotine can potentially have effects on every organ system in the body. Addiction is expected with regular use of nicotine, but its health consequences are determined primarily by the delivery system, cigarettes being the worst. Nicotine is much less hazardous to cardiovascular health than smoking, but may contribute to acute cardiovascular events, particularly in the presence of cardiovascular disease. Nicotine is a reproductive hazard and should be avoided during pregnancy, except when it's used for smoking cessation. And I want to make that clear. I'm not against anything to get people to quit smoking. There is a biological plausibility for nicotine to promote cancer, to enhance infectious disease risk, and contribute to chronic lung disease. This risk is likely low based on the safety of Swedish snus, but I think we need more data to know if this does pose any significant human risk. And the last thing is, because users titrate nicotine dose to desired effect, nicotine doses in non-combusted products should not be limited. In fact, higher nicotine content products might be safer due to less exposure to other chemicals that carry the nicotine. So thank you for your attention.